It's Julie Bindell. Hello. Julie, welcome to the show. It's always a delight to see you. Now, you've moved into podcasting, haven't you? What have you been doing?
Hasn't everyone?
Everyone does it. Everyone's got a podcast. That's how we communicate these days.
It's true.
So yours is called Julie in Genderland.
Yes, and I kept hearing from parents about the fact that their children, usually same-sex attracted, mainly female, but some boys as well, mainly autistic, who were being encouraged or enabled in schools and by social workers and clinicians and the like to believe that they were born in the wrong body and that they can change sex, and that this was a completely fine and almost easy, simple thing to do, often without the parents' knowledge, let alone consent. And so the more stories that I heard, the more I realised that, you know, you can't really fit these stories and the layers of horror and complexity into even a long-form article.
Yeah.
And that what people needed to actually hear was the distress and the determination and the anger in the voices of the parents, but also the clarity of the experts, Dr. Az Hakim, who's here this weekend, Hannah Barnes, who wrote the brilliant book, Time to Think, Stephanie Arai Davis from Transgender Trend. You know, all of these people who we've heard speak and we've seen campaign and fight for the rights of children, not to be put through what is an insidious, modern-day, anti-gay, anti-lesbian conversion therapy. So that's why I decided to do the series.
And of course, a lot of people would say, a lot of your critics would say, yes, but we are just being compassionate by affirming the identity that the children tell us they are. I mean, what do you make of that?
What, you mean I've got critics?
I'm sorry to break that to you.
They would say that. They're trying to make it illegal, in fact, to do anything other than affirm young people who go to see a therapist or any kind of expert in distress that presents itself as gender dysphoria. And that if you actually say, well, might it be that their sexual abuse, I mean, not this starkly, but if they try to explore issues, for example, with girls, of self-hatred, with knowing that they're lesbian, or having experienced sexual abuse, going through puberty, which is really hard. It's hard for girls and boys, but it's particularly hard for girls, where there's sexual harassment and bullying, or where there's any mental ill health or domestic violence in the home. Instead of exploring those issues, they're just put straight away into the one-stop shop of, gender affirmation. And of course, we know, everyone knows, that a well-functioning, healthy child, young person, would not be drawn into the cult of gender ideology as easily as one who, has had none of these problems, the aforementioned problems.
Yes.
So it's clearly a response to something traumatic that's happened, or it's desperate, children that are desperate for some sort of attention, becoming quite narcissistic and attention-seeking, and everyone running around after them saying, yes, of course, you're trans, how wonderful are you? You're a special person, and we will tell your parents that they have got nothing to be concerned about. In fact, in the story of one of the families, in fact more than one, that's in the podcast series, we're told that the child had to go and live with other relatives because the parents would not go along with the fact that their daughter was now their son, a boy. These are proper horror stories.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the impact on girls. If you go back to the origins of the Tavistock, it was a handful of patients, all boys, or mostly boys, and that's completely flipped.
Yes.
And now it seems to be disproportionately girls identifying out of femaleness, not just as the opposite sex, also as non-binary. What do you make of all that?
Well, I know from my own experience growing up in the 1970s and being outed at school as a lesbian before I was ready to speak about it, and I had two brothers who were very active and had more freedom than me. And we were in a very close, loving family, so it wasn't that we were treated like, females under Sharia law. But it was the idea that I could be a boy would have been extremely attractive at the time.
Right.
And so what I see now with girls, particularly when you look at the spike in referrals from Blackpool in the northwest of England, the poorest town, I think, in the UK right now, where there's the highest rates of drug abuse, of suicide attempts and suicides amongst young people, sexual abuse, convicted sex offenders of children come out of prison and gravitate towards Blackpool because it's a seaside town with lots of vulnerable kids and there's amusement arcades. When you look at the spike in girls presenting or being presented as trans, and they're not from Brighton, they're not from Trans Tinseltown, they're from a very poor town, and you ask yourself the question, well, what have all of these girls got in common? Well, a social worker, right? Because they're all troubled.
Yeah.
There won't be one young girl, one female, who presents at the northern GIDS who isn't troubled, sexually abused, groomed in gangs, bullied at school, same-sex attracted, autistic, can't cope with it. Why are we not treating any of these problems, and instead we're sending them down the gender route from which some of them can never return? And that's why I think girls are increasingly presenting as trans, because they're being told that this is maybe the answer to all of their problems.
But of course, you've been campaigning throughout your life for women's rights, against violence against women. Do you think the situation we're facing now is worse in some ways than it was back in the day?
It is. I mean, I have to keep optimistic because feminists have to be optimistic for obvious reasons. And I think that we've made great gains, but we're in danger of losing all of them. And the problem right now is the complacency with which we treat male sexual violence towards women and girls, the normalisation through pornography, through systems such as prostitution and Teen Vogue telling girls that they should enjoy being spat at, choked and strangled during sex. All of this. In some ways, culturally, it's worse. Legislatively, in many ways, it's better, thanks to feminists. But we can lose it all in a heartbeat. And I think if you've got a situation where, as in Scotland and elsewhere, where there's no such thing as a female-only rape crisis service that feminists set up because we knew that women that presented to these services were walking out of the door if there was a man in the room, we set up women-only services. We now not only have a situation in Scotland and elsewhere where women are being told that they are not allowed to ask the gender, so-called gender, of counsellors that they might be speaking very openly to about their rape, but we had a man running the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre. So that, if someone had told me 10 years ago that that could happen, I would not have believed them.
I don't think many people would. It's absolutely incredible. So you've done the podcast series. Well, it's still going, isn't it, at the moment? But
yes.
there's already 9 or so episodes already out there. Can people see them or listen
yes,
to them, rather?
You can listen to them on all the usual channels and on my Substack. And as we go along, we'll be adding to those episodes. At first, we thought we'd do 4, and then it just grew and grew. And for the parents and for the young people, we do have one young woman, a lesbian, who was transitioned from age 15, who is now 18, living very happily as a lesbian, and she's turned her back on all of the gender nonsense.
Right.
So that's the good news.
Yeah.
And of course, that the experts, including the parents, and those of us that have been talking about this for a long time, are now being listened to.
Fantastic, and it'd be really interesting to hear their stories about this. So it's called Julie in Genderland. It's available on Julie Bindell's Substack. Julie, thanks so much for joining me.